Hi everyone, my next topic is depth and size perception. Now that may seem like they're just two random things put together for no reason, but as we'll see, they are very closely related. Here are the learning objectives. We'll talk about different types of depth information. We can categorize them a bunch of different ways, and in fact the categories can even overlap to some extent. As number 2, I'll focus on one particular depth cue called binocular disparity, and we'll see how this produces our experience of seeing in stereo called stereopsis. Take a brief detour through autostereograms, including surds, and talk about how they produce stereopsis. So this is something that you can experience for yourself. Number 4 is the big theoretical problem called the correspondence problem. Does that sound familiar? If it does, if you go back to the motion perception lecture, I did introduce the motion correspondence problem. This just shares a word in common with that. It is, however, a theoretical problem. It doesn't get in the way of us actually perceiving anything, but it makes it pretty difficult to explain how we perceive depth. And I'll talk a little bit about the development of depth perception. I don't mention a lot about perceptual development, but I will do that with this topic. Switching gears a little bit, the last learning outcomes are about size and another perceptual constancy, size constancy. And once again, we have available to us other information that allows us to maintain this perceptual constancy. Talk a bit about illusions, so a bit of fun stuff, and the moon illusion, which is not a two-dimensional kind of pencil and paper illusion. It's an illusion you can experience in the real 3D world. And then I'll talk a little bit about human factors and ergonomics. Okay, so this is the field that I work in now. I'm going to tie it into perception, but I got to talk about it somewhere. It's something that I have a passion for it, okay? But first, depth and size perception, but really this first one is going to be all about depth perception. There are a couple of different types of depth perception. One is called absolute distance judgment, in which you make quite literally egocentric localization. That is, how far am I from an object? And by and large, this is what we're going to be looking at, is egocentric or absolute distance and depth perception. But to get there, sometimes we will use relative information, relative distance judgment, in which we try to decide how far away one object is from another object. And the idea here is that, well, one of these objects, we're going to have to figure out how close it is to us. So indirectly, we may figure out how far away other objects are. Now, by and large, this lecture is structured around the different categories of depth cues. Some people call them clues. They are pieces of information we have at our disposal to get out of our two-dimensional or 2.5-dimensional retinal image to try and reconstruct a three-dimensional world. The first category is monocular depth cues, which literally means one eye depth cues. If you only have one eye, that's too bad, but you can still get some depth out of the world around you. A subcategory is pictorial depth cues, which are depth cues in pictures. Okay, pictures, drawings, or photographs, paintings, these kinds of things. Speaking of which, so I will be working in some fine art for my illustrations. I'm allowed to do that. Okay, I'm allowed to put art in a science course. Just watch me. Okay, so our first pictorial depth cue is occlusion, and my apologies for the terrible definition. So if one object covers part of another object, then you know that that object is closer than the other object. What a terrible definition that is. It's easier to see than to define. And of course, this is not an example of that in this painting. It's actually playing with occlusion. It's kind of tough to tell what's in front and what's behind. So this tree looks like it's in front and the horse is behind it, but then this tree is in front of the... It's kind of mind-bending, which a lot of René Magritte's art is. This next one is shading and shadows. So this example is called the pimples and dimples, because if you look at these circles, Some of them are convex pimples, and some of them are concave dimples. And we make an assumption, and that assumption is light is coming from above us. That's kind of an unspoken assumption, but it does govern our perception. Assuming that light comes from above us, this must be a pimple which is casting some shading on the lower part of it, and vice versa for the dimples. Now, what I want you to do is to pick your favorite pimple or dimple, that's right, pick one, and keep a close eye on it as I rotate this around. Hey, what happened? Your pimple is now a dimple or vice versa. That's pretty fun. Next, in no particular order, we have atmospheric perspective. So this one says that the more distance between you and an object, the bluer and fuzzier the distant object will be. So clearly this canyon has a lot of red rock formations, but the one off into the distance looks kind of purplish, almost bluish. Now it's not actually blue, it's because there's more atmosphere between you and it, and it's refracting more of the light, especially the blue wavelengths. This has actually been around and known for quite some time, at least as far back as Leonardo da Vinci. And he wrote that if in painting, if one is to be 5 times as distant, make it 5 times bluer. I don't know what 5 times bluer means, but he actually did incorporate that in his painting Virgin of the Rocks. Next, we have relative size. Now, I'm willing to bet that all of these baseball players are about the same height, probably around 6'1", 6'2", about as tall as me, for all you know. But some of them are so big that we only capture them up to the waist. They're gigantic. They're enormous. Is this attack of the 60-foot Chicago Cubs? No, I don't think so. It's just that some of them are closer, and then some of them are farther away. So if we think of the size in the two-dimensional plane, some of them are smaller and therefore farther away. Now, a lot of these are bottom-up kinds of things, but some of them do incorporate our knowledge of the world, as this next one does. This one is familiar size. So these coins are all exactly the same size on the screen, but that can't be it. That's impossible, because I know some of these coins are larger and some of them are smaller. Now, if each one of these coins casts the same size retinal image, which one must be the closest to us? It must be the dime. That one must be closest, and the others are farther away. The next one is called linear perspective by most people. For some reason, I don't know why, the textbook refers to it as perspective convergence. It's kind of an outlier. Nobody really uses that. In linear perspective, we have things that are in straight lines, but it looks to us like they are getting kind of closer together. So these landing lights, I'm sure, are all equidistant from each other, but it looks like they're getting closer and converging together at what's called the vanishing point. Sounds kind of mysterious. Now, linear perspective was of interest even to people in the Renaissance. So I want to go back to the Renaissance, and I'm going to work in some more art. So Brunelleschi invented what's called Brunelleschi's peep show, and it's not what you think it is, okay? This is completely suitable for work. Okay, what Brunelleschi did was he went to the baptistry, which is a building in Florence, Italy. I've actually been there once. And he painted over its reflection in a mirror. Okay. Why did he do that? So that he would have a perfect copy of how the baptistry actually looked. Now, this is only step 1. Step 2 is to take his painting and then drill a hole through it. Okay, and then face the painting toward the baptistry. Are you keeping track of this? And then what you do is you look through the hole toward the baptistry. Okay, so what you see is the baptistry looking through this peephole. And the last step involves another mirror. Okay, so here's the observer, and this person is facing the baptistry. Okay, they're holding the painting, and then they hold up another mirror facing towards them. I know this is complicated. This is what the person would see, okay? So they're looking through the peephole, and they can see the actual baptistry, okay? And then when they hold up the mirror, you can see that they see the reflection of the baptistry that's been painted onto the mirror, and it is a seamless match for the actual baptistry that they're looking at with their actual eyeballs. Okay, that's a lot of work. I know it's a bit complex and confusing. What's the point of all of this? What Brunelleschi was trying to illustrate was the importance of this particular depth cue, which, if you've lost track of it, it's linear perspective. It is lines that converge. Well, what lines are converging? Okay, so there is the baptistry, and it's not a square building if you look at its footprint, okay? So it does have these lines that we can extend off until they converge into the vanishing point. And there are actually a couple of vanishing points. This actually determines the horizon. If you connect the two vanishing points, this is your standing eye height horizon. This is key to painting it in a way that it looks ultimately realistic. This is something called the two-point perspective because there are two vanishing points. So again, what he's kind of doing is proving that linear perspective is really, really important when it comes to painting things that are very vivid and lifelike and three-dimensional. So just to talk about point perspective for a second, this is an example of one-point perspective in which these geometric figures all converge on one vanishing point. In contrast, we have two-point perspective, and here we have two vanishing points. So again, the point of what Brunelleschi did was establishing that linear perspective is really important for an artist to consider. So let's just compare and contrast for a sec here. Let's go back to 1070. This is part of a really, really giant tapestry. So this is some detail of this tapestry from 1070. It may be a significant work of art from over 1,000 years ago, but is it beautiful? Not really. Is it vivid and three-dimensional? Not so much. So let's take a look at something from 500 years later. Hold on to your socks. Okay, whoa. Like that. That is some amazing art. Okay, there's a lot of depth cues in there, including some linear perspective. This is the School of Athens, and I was lucky enough to see this in person too. It is no less amazing in person. I'm bragging a lot, aren't I? So what can artists do to take advantage of linear perspective beyond knowing, this is something that's important? Do they want to go around painting on mirrors? No. So we turn to Leon Alberti and what's been called Alberti's window, or Alberti's grid, or just perspective grid. What you do if you're wanting to paint a landscape is look at it through a window or a pane of glass divided into cells. Okay? And then what the artist does is have a piece of paper, also with a grid, and simply copies what they see in each cell onto the paper. What's the point of that? What it does is it overcomes top-down bias. Now, going back to that tapestry from 1070, there was a lot of top-down processing in there. You can also see this in the drawing of young children. They draw based on concepts, like, you're a person, you're a whole person. So the earliest drawings that the very youngest children make, here's a picture of my mummy, and she's like a circle with like a little head on it, representing the wholeness of mother. And then gradually, as children get older, they will draw things more as they look like, as opposed to what they think. Oh, you have to have arms and legs, and they got to be sticking out on the sides. Not necessarily very realistic. If you can draw or paint in a bottom-up fashion, then what you are creating is a close match for how it actually looks. It's more representational, if that's your thing. The last word on perspective, I will present is this satire on false perspective from 1753, and if you look closely at it, there are many, many, many violations of perspective, depth, and distance. So, for example, this person is on the top of a faraway hill, and yet their pipe, I guess, is being lit by this person leaning out of the window of this tower that's in the foreground, and there are lots and lots of examples of that scattered throughout. So if you want to have some fun, check this one out. Okay, back to more depth cues. Next one is called relative height. Now it has to do with the horizon, so I'm going to talk about it kind of with respect to that, starting below the horizon. If we're just looking at objects that are below the horizon, in this picture, I've got a couple of cacti, pretty obviously, and it's pretty clear which one is closer to us. It's the one on the left, because it is farther from the horizon. It is lower down. The one on the right is a bit higher in the two-dimensional picture. It is closer to the horizon. Now, this doesn't just mean that the higher something is in a two-dimensional picture, the farther away it is. We also have a couple of birds in the sky here. Again, the one that's farther from the horizon, the one on the left, appears to be a bit closer to us than the one that's closer to the horizon. Now, out of everything in this picture, the thing that is the farthest away, aside from the clouds, is the mesa, which here kind of defines the horizon. Our next monocular depth cue, our pictorial depth cue, is texture gradient. And here the texture is these sunflowers. The sunflowers that are closest to us, you can see a lot of detail. You can make out the individual petals, I guess, of the sunflower. And as they recede off into the distance, eventually you can't really even make out individual sunflowers. They seem to be getting smaller and closer together. Texture gradient is considered a higher order depth cue because it is made up of two basic depth cues, linear perspective and relative size. Now we also have monocular depth cues that incorporate motion. So these are not necessarily pictorial depth cues, so we're subdividing the category. One of these is motion parallax. So please don't do this if you're driving a vehicle. If someone else is driving it, or if you're on a bus, for example, if you look out to the side, things that are very, very close to the road seem to be going by very quickly. So mailboxes or things like telephone poles or things like that, they'll just seem to whip by very, very fast. The farther from the road, the slower things seem to be moving by. And things that are way, way off in the distance, like maybe distant buildings or even clouds, they actually seem to be moving with you, even though you're actually moving past them at the same rate that you're moving past things that are nearby the road. So that's motion parallax. We can try to simulate it. This is called, seriously, wiggle stereoscopy. So it's two photographs taken almost right side by side, and then they're presented in rapid alternation. And this looks kind of sort of three-dimensional-ish. It's really tough to take with a regular camera because you got to be really fast taking two pictures side by side. You can do it if it's a static shot, like a statue, but it's more impressive if it's of motion, like this person diving into a pool. Now, these next two are actually implied by motion parallax. They are deletion, which means that something that's farther away is getting covered up by a foreground object, and its counterpart, accretion, means that it's being uncovered. And again, you only get that with motion. Our next category are oculomotor depth cues. These include things like accommodation, the fact that the lens in your eye changes shape to keep focus on objects, so that the image on your retina is sharp and clear. There's actually feedback from receptors in your ciliary muscles that sends information back to your brain that tells you about how far away the object is, which is kind of strange because it's your brain sending information to those muscles in the first place, but that's coming from the motor cortex. The feedback you get goes to the part of your brain that calculates and computes distance. This next one is called convergence. We want to extract as much information as possible from the world around us. We want objects to fall on our fovea. And as objects move closer and closer to us, we actually have to rotate our eyes in their sockets inwards to keep the image of that object in sharp focus and a lot of detail on our fovea. So we can describe the angle that is created by the line of sight from our two eyes. As an object is closer, the angle is larger in terms of degrees. That's something important to keep in mind. Now, ocular motor depth cues are actually fairly limited. They only work for distances up to about 2 meters away. What happens after 2 meters? Beyond about 2 meters, the lens in your eye is completely relaxed. There's no accommodation happening. And there's no convergence angle. The line of sight from your eyes, they go out in parallel. We can't even calculate the convergence angle. I've been presenting each of these depth cues and giving you definitions and pictures as well, and really they are an oversimplification. In the real world, or even a lot of times in pictures, it's impossible to present one single depth cue and only one. There are multiple depth cues available, and it's been found that these multiple depth cues will interact with each other. So typically we get a number of depth cues all present at once. Turns out that our accuracy in judging distance is an additive relation between depth cues, meaning the more depth cues are present, we get incrementally better at estimating distance. So if there's a painting and you can count up exactly how many depth cues there are, you can make some prediction about people estimating the distance that they see in that painting. Also, our perception of depth is vivid and stronger the more depth cues are present. So if you are an artist, if you want to create representational art, something that is vivid and immersive, you want to use as many depth cues as you possibly can. My final category is the most important category, binocular depth cues, meaning two-eye depth cues. Now, we've actually already seen one binocular depth cue, and that was convergence. So this is what I mean by the categories overlap a bit. But when it comes to binocular depth cues, the one that really is the most important is binocular disparity, which literally means difference between the two eyes, or between the two retinas. And that's because in the real world, when we look out at an object, the images of that object fall on slightly different regions of each eye's retina. Binocular disparity gives rise to stereopsis, or seeing in stereo. If you go and see a 3D movie for your extra $3, what you're getting is the experience of stereopsis. Now, to understand stereopsis, we have to bring up an imaginary surface called the horopter. The horopter exists at a certain distance from you, and that distance is defined by your fixation point. Now, that can change from moment to moment. It is not fixed. It does change from moment to moment depending on what you're focusing on. So let me show you some images here. Okay, so just let me explain. Okay, we've got a couple of eyes, our left eye and right eye in cross-section, and these eyes are looking at object at F. Okay, now that defines the horopter. So the eyes are, they're accommodated probably. There's some convergence there. So they're fixating on point F. And this defines the horopter. It exists at this distance away from us. Now if we take a look at the image of object F, it'll fall on spot FL in the left eye and FR in the right eye. And that's basically the fovea. It was a good choice picking F for focus, F for fovea. So they're on exactly the same spot. Now, I know it's kind of hard to tell, so let me take these cross sections of the eyes and derotate them and overlap them. Okay, there we see FL and FR are on the same spot. These are called corresponding points. So the image falls on the same location on each retina. Okay, so we know how far away object F is because we're accommodating to it, we're converging to it, all of these things. But then we also have object G, which is just a bit off to the side. We're not looking directly at it, but it also happens to fall on the horopter. So again, it falls on the left retina, just a little bit to the right of the fovea. The same is true of the right retina. It falls just to the right of the fovea. Again, GL and GR, those are corresponding points. What we get is no disparity. Now what this means is there's no difference between FL and FR. There's no difference between GL and GR. And there's another thing that happens. If you are focused on an object, you will not see two of it floating in front of you. If you're focusing on your screen right now, you will not see two screens. If you hold up your finger and don't focus on it, you're going to see two fingers. So let's take a look at that condition. Now, nothing has changed. The person is still focusing on the point F, but now we've introduced a new object, A, and it is closer to us than the horopter. So if you are looking at your screen right now, that is where your horopter is. And if you hold up your finger, I didn't want to use F for finger, okay? So A represents your finger, you will see two fingers. The image of object A falls over here in the left retina, over there in the right retina. Let's take a look at that. These are non-corresponding points. They are different points. AL is to the left of the fovea, AR is to the right of the fovea. Now we can actually measure the difference or the distance between AL and AR. This is called the degree of disparity or the angle of disparity. Because the retina is a curved surface, it doesn't make sense to use a linear measure like a millimeter, so instead we use angles. And the rule is, the farther an object is from the horopter, the greater the disparity. So, if you have a screen that's pretty far away, you hold up your finger close to the screen, again you're focusing on the screen, those two fingers that you see are going to be pretty close together. Now if you move your hand closer to your face, which is literally what I'm doing right now, those two fingers, they're getting closer to me, yes, but the distance between them is also getting larger because of the greater degree of disparity. Now, that's not exactly experimental control, and we also don't have a fundamental explanation of how some of this happens. So, in order to do both of those things, a researcher named Bella Hulez used the massive supercomputers at Bell Labs in the mid-1960s to create what are called random dot stereograms. Okay, so each eye will see one of these patterns. Left eye sees this pattern, right eye sees this pattern, and they do just look like random dots. In fact, generally, these are exactly the same pattern. So it's the same pattern repeated, except kind of hard to see with the naked eye. There is an exception. In the middle of each one of these squares is a square-shaped region that is slightly shifted over. It's a bit shifted over to the right in the right eye image and slightly over to the left in the left eye image. Now what this does is it creates retinal disparity. Now what you have to do is actually look at these two patterns in a device called a stereogram, and you can't exactly do that by looking at your screen, so you're going to have to take my word for it a little bit. Once these two patterns are showed in this kind of device, what happens is that the central region that has been shifted over seems to kind of pop out from the background and seems to be floating. It induces a three-dimensional effect. And this is kind of sort of, when you pay your extra $3 for a 3D movie, this is what they're doing. They're either filming it with two cameras, or they're filming it with one camera and then taking that film, splitting it into two, and then shifting parts of the image over a little bit. You can buy devices. I have a cherished childhood toy called the Viewmaster, in which there are little cartoons or photographs that do produce stereopsis. Pretty cool. I wish I could show you. Starting in the 1990s, using the power of computers, some very clever images started to be produced. Now, these are called single-image random dot stereograms. So they've kind of inherited this from the random dot stereograms created by Hules, and instead of having just black and white dots, you can see this image is made up of kind of stars, and a lot of them are sort of overlapping. Now, what you have to do to see this is a bit artificial. So if you just look at this image, ain't nothing happening, okay? I've actually borrowed this from magiceye.com, and they've got plenty of these. Let me explain these single image random dot stereograms, SIRDs, or auto stereograms, as they're also called. Now, you can get retinal disparity and the experience of three-dimensionality, but it's very, very different from Hules's random dot stereograms. So with the random dot stereograms and the ViewMaster, you've got two slightly different images that are shown to the same part of each retina. But with SIRDs, you have one single image, and then it's up to you as the observer to see it in a really abnormal, unusual kind of way, so that each image that you see in each eye falls on different parts of each retina. I know it's weird. Here are the steps if you want to try to see an auto stereogram. Step 1 is to have a small angle of convergence. So it probably won't work if you're looking at this on a large computer monitor. If you go to magiceye.com on your phone, you can bring it up full screen, and this might work a little bit better. Step 1 is to have a small convergence angle. Small. That means you're actually focusing on something far away, even though your phone is fairly close to you. So now you have to take your eyes and shift them from the distant wall onto your phone without focusing on it, without changing your convergence angle. Some people can't do it, and they just can't do this step. If you can't do this, don't feel badly. You're not missing out on a lot. Now, if you do it properly, if you can do this, you will now see two overlapping images. This is kind of like focusing on the computer screen, holding up your finger and seeing two fingers. Now, they might be a bit fuzzy, so what you have to do is try to change your accommodation of your lens without changing your convergence. Some people can't do that. If you can't do that, no big deal. Doesn't mean there is anything wrong with you. You want to try to keep those images in focus, but having still two floating, overlapping images. The last step is to kind of fine-tune your convergence until the repeating parts of that picture line up horizontally. So this has been calculated by a computer very carefully so that the pattern does repeat. Now, the image that I showed you a couple of slides ago had a couple of dots. If you are trying to do that with this image, you will see two dots in each eye. And to line things up, you actually have to line it up so that you only see three dots. And that means that you've lined it up perfectly. If you can do all of that after all of these steps, your reward is to see a floating shape. And at the Magic Eye website, it's kind of set up like a little puzzle. Like, what is the shape? It might be a square, or it might be a diamond, or a star, or like a spaceship. Yeah, if you don't see it, you're not really missing too much. Okay, I need to get to the important, tough, theoretical problem called the correspondence problem. And it's a question of matching. So each eye does not get the exact same picture of the world, and that's because our eyes are laterally offset in our heads. Each eye gets a slightly different picture of the world. But how does the brain take these two technically different images and stitch them together into one holistic percept? Our vision has been called cyclopean, which seems a bit counterintuitive. Well, wait, I have two eyes. I'm not a cyclops. Cyclopean refers to the image that you see in your mind's eye. You see one image, even though you have two eyes. So we can try presenting very, very simple stimuli like 4 dots to people. How does the visual system know that this dot is the same dot that you're seeing in this eye? How does it match like 1 to 5 and 2 to 6 and 3 to 7 and 4 to 8? Why doesn't it match like 1 with 8 and 2 with 7 and 3 with 6? How does it match it and match it correctly? It's complicated. Let me just kind of summarize and say It's way complicated. In fact, it's kind of beyond the scope of this course. Then why did you bring it up? I'm sorry, I want you to know about this theoretical problem, but it's not like I can solve it for you, okay? There isn't one universally accepted solution to this. One comprehensive attempt to this was developed by David Marr and Tommaso Poggio in 1976. They actually developed a artificial neural network that depends on a number of properties, including similarity. Now, you're not going to match something in your left eye, say a black dot, to something in your right eye, like a white dot. No, those are two different things. You can only match things that are similar in lots of different ways, like color, for example, and maybe shape and other things beyond that. This is only one component. There are some other components in their artificial neural network, and it's not universally accepted. So if you're really desperate to know about this, hey, you can do some research on this, or I do talk about it in my advanced perception course in a little bit more detail. What is this, a cell job? Okay, as promised, I do want to talk a little bit about perceptual development. I don't talk a lot about it in this course because the department offers other courses that include perceptual and cognitive development. Go ahead and take that course. You'll love it. But I do want to turn to it now because perception might be able to help us answer some really big picture questions, like is perception innate or is it learned? I know learned is a funny word, but by learned, I mean, does experiencing the environment shape our perception? So one of the classic experiments I need to talk about was done by Richard Walk and Eleanor Jackie Gibson, the wife of J.J. Gibson, in 1961. If you've taken a developmental psychology course or Psych 105, you'll be familiar with this already. It is the visual cliff experiment. So what you do is you have a tabletop and you cover it with a very high contrast pattern, and then there's this kind of cliff here, but you actually cover the tabletop and everything with a thick pane of glass. So it's not an actual cliff. Who'd put a baby on an actual cliff? No, it's just a visual cliff, okay? So it looks like the baby could fall, okay? And then the parent stands over here at this end and they kind of entice the baby. Come on, baby, come over the cliff. Come on, come to me. And then you see what happens. What they found in their initial experiment in 1961, that very few babies would actually crawl over the cliff to the deep side. A lot of them would stay on the tabletop and just like cry and be very frustrated that Mommy's trying to kill me. They repeated this experiment with all kinds of animals, a lot of mammals, even ones that basically had just been born and could just barely sort of locomote. Most mammals will avoid the cliff, interestingly. But that's not to say all animals do. Certain turtles just would go back and forth. They really didn't care. What's wrong with these turtles? Do they have a death wish? Is that why turtles are dying? No. Think about turtles underwater. If there's a cliff, I'm making air quotes here, a cliff underwater, it doesn't matter. You can just swim. You're not going to fall or anything. Which always makes me think of Finding Nemo. You know how the little kids in Finding Nemo were so terrified of the drop-off? Who cares about... They're not going to fall down the drop. They can swim. They can just swim over it and swim back. You're not going to fall. You're underwater. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, the conclusion from Walk and Gibson, and I have to point out, this is their conclusion. They concluded that there is an innate component to perception. You're born like with the ability to pick up depth, and this is seen in your actions that you will avoid cliffs. But then what about those three exceptions? What about those three babies that did crawl over to the deep side? Oh, well, they win the Darwin Awards. No, that's not it. Unfortunately, there were confounds in this original experiment. So let's take a look at some of that. So since this original 1961 experiment, this has been replicated and examined many hundreds, if not thousands of times, one of the confounds might be that you need infants who can crawl, who can self-locomote. Here's the problem with that. That's not a developmental milestone. Some kids, they don't crawl. They just lie there, and then one day they're walking. And other kids will crawl and crawl and crawl and take forever until they start to walk. Okay, so it's not a developmental milestone. So in this study, they used pre-crawling infants, so hadn't crawled yet, about 7 months old in general. The experimental group were given experience in a walker. This is a walker. These are banned now. They are illegal because, sadly, they led to a number of injuries and deaths. You put an infant in there, and they can kick their legs, and this thing has wheels, so they can actually move around. So even if they can't walk, they can like spaz out their legs and move this thing around. Unfortunately, a lot of infants tumble down the stairs, so it's a very dangerous thing. You can't even buy these. They're maybe on the black market. So they were given experience in a walker, even though they couldn't walk yet. And the control group, well, they didn't get to play in one of these walkers. Carefully controlled and supervised. Can I say that? Okay. After being given this experience or not, they took their infants and, oh dear, they dangled them. This sounds worse than it is. Dangled them over the deep side of the visual cliff. Okay? And they measured the heart rate. This is important because the group that had experience in the walker saw their heart rates go up. And this is a way that an infant can tell us they are afraid. Oh, I'm over the deep side. It's dangerous. The control group heart rate did not change. So they're like, yeah, okay, I don't know. What else you got? I'm not scared of this. They hadn't learned that there is this potential visual cliff drop-off that presents a danger to them. So what is the most important thing? It looks like it's actually experience. So this really goes against the conclusions from Walk and Gibson. It's not inborn. It is experience in the world. But we have to be careful about that. We can't just say, oh, it's environment. It's not genetics. That's an oversimplification too. It's an interaction. You have to have the predisposition to see and to be able to pick up depth. And you have to have the proper kind of experience in the world to get the full perception of depth. Tricky, isn't it? So this kind of research ties into other research on what's called sensitive periods or critical periods. So there's a certain window of opportunity as we develop when we're younger in which we require certain environmental experience in order to develop the full normal perceptual abilities. After a certain amount of time, that window of opportunity closes. And after that, no amount of experience will give rise to normal perceptual development. So we can see that things like binocular depth develops pretty early on for such a powerful and sophisticated mechanism, developing somewhere between 3 and 5 months of age. Collision information can be processed by infants as young as 2 to 3 weeks old. How do you measure that? Okay, you kind of go up to an infant and you take like your hand and you kind of go like up to their face. You don't punch them. Okay, that's not the goal here. But if you do this to a young infant, they're going to kind of close their eyes and purse their lips as if they're bracing for a collision. Pictorial depth cues actually start to emerge later at 6 to 7 months, and then depth from shadows and shading may not appear until 3 years of age. So this might be kind of the most complex kind of depth information to process. Just to give you some idea of where certain things develop, we can't say that, oh, vision develops at this age, or it's present at birth. That's a vast oversimplification. It really depends. So all kinds of different things emerge at all kinds of different ages. I just wanted to show this to you so you could get kind of the big picture. No, I'm not going to test you on this graph. I'll stop part 1 here.